Morning, everybody. Welcome to the first webinar that we are organizing within the Prosperity Project. Prosperity is a Horizon 2020 project which deals with the broad take-up of SUMP, the planning principle of the European Commission. Our aim is to spread the idea, especially to those countries and cities where the take-up so far is not so high as in other countries. We want to build capacities. We want to reach national governments so that they take a leading role in the development of the SUMP supporting programs, and also by the take-up of cities to use these planning principles. Today is our first webinar out of 6 webinars that we are going to offer until February. On our website, you can see the other topics. I hope you will join us later. As you could see, it is also our first webinar that we are organizing, so please be a little bit patient with us if not everything works properly. The speaker for today is Karl-Heinz Bosch. He is, we could say, a pioneer for mobility management and land use planning. He will talk about this topic in connection with SUMP. He is the managing director of Austrian Mobility Research. How about the webinars? How do we organize it? It will be maximum 60 minutes. We will stop the webinar after 60 minutes. We are going to record the webinar. You will receive a link for what we are recording, and you can watch it later when we finish it. We will start with about 15 minutes presentation by Karl-Heinz. Then we have a session with question and answers. Please use the chat only, the chat function. I will collect the questions. I will give it to Karl-Heinz because he's concentrated on his speaking. After about 15 minutes of question and answers, we will continue with the second part of his presentation and have another session on question and answers. I think that's it from my side as the moderator. I will mute myself now and I will give the floor to Karl-Heinz. Karl-Heinz, please start with your presentation.
Okay, so I hope this all works. You should be able to see my presentation now because I have control of the screen now. And yeah, it's about land use planning and mobility management and how this connect with SUMPs. On the first slide, you see that I was the MAX coordinator, which has a little bit relationship with the whole topic, and that I was the EPOM coordinator, and I was also advisor for the mobility concept of Aspern Seestadt, where I had to deal exactly with this subject. And I will explain about it later. So I want to start with some people. Wim from Groningen, Lucas from Zurich, Barbara from Bochum, and Petros from Nicosia, and what activities they do during the day. So for example, Wim has 3 to 4 trips per day and 1 to 2 activities. This means a trip means I go from the house to my job, for example, and then go back. That's 2 trips and 1 activity. And then maybe I go shopping and I go back, and that's another activity and 2 more trips. And on average, Wim uses 1 to 1.5 hours travel time for this. For Lucas in Zurich, the numbers are the same. For Barbara in Bochum as well, and for Petros in Nicosia as well. This is an average that you can see on the whole world. On average, everybody makes about 3 to 4 trips per day and uses about 1 to 1.5 hours. So if everybody has the same behavior, why is there so much difference in the fuel consumption per capita? You can see here that Wim uses about 340 liters per year, Lucas 440 liters, but Barbara 1010, and Petros from Nicosia 1418. Well, the reason is very simple. They all do the same on average per day, but they use very different modes, and it depends what mode they use in a city, how this average energy use looks like. Now, for example, here you have Groningen, where you see 22% of the trips are made by walking, 39% by bicycle, 33% by car, and 6% by public transport. So Groningen is a bicycle city. And yeah, it's clear that on average, the fuel use is quite low. Similar in Zurich, you have, it's one of the best public transport cities in the world. It has 42% public transport. But in Bochum, you have 58% of car use, and in Nicosia, you have 75%. So you see, depending on the modal split, is how the mobility looks like, and that's what you want to manage. Now, and there are some elements how you can manage this mobility. One thing is you can market sustainable mobility at the right spot. So where people make the decision, at home or in schools or at the place where you work or for events, you can go exactly there and explain what the options are for mobility, for sustainable mobility, and make it more attractive. It's also important that you market it at the right time. So, for example, when you change your house, when you get a new job, when you get children, when your children go to a new school, when you buy a car, these are moments when you really think about your mobility. One aspect of mobility management is also that you want to have a more effective use of the car, for example, by car sharing or by carpooling. And you use incentives and disincentives. So a disincentive, the stick, you could say, is parking management, where you have to pay for parking or where you can also only park in a limited time, or also congestion charging. Yeah? And then on the other hand, you have incentives which help you to do sustainable mobility, to use sustainable modes. Financial incentives, providing a nice and comfortable lifestyle, have supportive infrastructure measures like bicycle paths, bicycle parking, pedestrian zones, shared space zones. And the objective of this webinar is to show how you can integrate this sort of mobility management with land use planning. And it's all about the behavior. So it's changing the behavior that people in the time that they use on average, in the trips that they use on average, that they use sustainable modes. So now why is this combining this mobility management and land use planning effective? So one thing is you are already on the right spot. Yeah, you plan for a certain spot and you are already there. So you don't have a very general marketing, but a very specific for the spot where you're working on. Then, of course, you come at the right time. You come already before the whole development is there. You can influence the framework conditions. So you can influence whether this spot will be connected by a good cycling network or with public transport or not. You can also secure funding. You can force the developers in some way that they pay for it, or you can have certain money streams allocated for this land use development. You can even enforce mobility management. There are things like mobility contracts where the developers are obliged to do some sort of marketing for sustainable modes. What is also there that at the beginning you have the different stakeholders, for example, the public transport operators, the developers, the politicians, they all have to agree about things, so you can ensure a good cooperation also in the field of mobility management. Yeah, and that's why it makes sense to combine this and why it can be very effective. So why is it good to combine land use planning and mobility management? There are several reasons. So one thing is that when you think about mobility on the plot that you develop, then you have to think about, okay, how can I integrate sustainable transport? How can I make the planning connect to this? It leads, as I said, to a cooperation of different stakeholders. And you have to think also about how the mobility is organized on this new development. Do you want 10% cycling? Do you want 5% or 20%? And is this realistic? You have to think about such things and set sensible targets. It is then more economical It's of course also more ecological if people use more sustainable transport modes. It's socially juster because you provide access for everybody and not just for people who can afford cars. And in total, you also achieve a better quality of life in this new land development, and you have also a better use, a more efficient use of the land. So now I come to examples. This is, as I mentioned, I was involved in this. This is Vienna. It has about 1.8 million inhabitants, and it's growing very fast, so 1.5% per year. And what you see here is the metro network. So it's called U-Bahn in German, so that's why it's everywhere a U. And here you have the U2, the line number 2, which was recently extended. And it leads to a new development in the city that is called the Seestadt, the lake town, Aspern Seestadt. And they already built the new metro line to this place. And I'm going to show you a bit about this. So this is what it looked like in 2007. It was just an old airfield and some fields. So no development at all. And there was the plan developed to develop this new area into a city, a new city district. And this was the master plan from 2007. And the first thing that they built was the metro line. Here you can see it. So this is in 2010, I think. So you see the metro line coming from the distance. Here's the city center of Vienna. And it was already built before anything else was developed. This is the plan for the final development. In 2008, it was the plan to be ready in 2025. I think it will take a little bit longer. And we made the plan for the first development phase, which was going to be ready in 2016. So what we were asked to do is to develop mobility guidelines for this new part of the city. And what we did, at that time we had this European project MAX, and within it we could sort of integrate it. And we developed these mobility guidelines in a series of 5 workshops with local stakeholders. And one of the first things that we did is that we said, okay, you should now be able to hear me. I accidentally switched off my microphone. It's already on again, I guess, sorry. So I have the technician coming in, but it works again, sorry. So you have 20 to 25% of the people that should go on foot, 10 to 15% by bicycle, 40% with public transport, and 25% by car. This is very ambitious because it's a city district on the periphery, where normally about 50 to 60% of the people do their trips by car. We also set that we want to have a maximum parking allowance per apartment, per dwelling of lower than 1. So that was also one of the targets. And we should have a mobility fund so that mobility management measures can be financed. There are going to be information packages for new inhabitants, for new companies, for developers, and also for schools, so that all of these stakeholders could see, okay, what options are there for sustainable mobility? How do I inform my clients, my customers, my pupils, my parents? Also, the plan was to have a mobility center, so a center with staff where you can ask about all aspects of mobility and where you can buy tickets or year tickets. Another suggestion was the concentration of car parking in collective garages, and that on-street parking should be paid. We wanted to have a supply of e-bikes, of car sharing spaces, and of the city bike system in Vienna, and a good infrastructure for cycling, obligatory parking, so very good parking standards for cycles in every house, cycle routes, and a cycle repair shop. And finally, also a good pedestrian infrastructure. So sort of the whole city should look more or less like a shared space. And streets should be very easy to cross, so not many traffic lights, but you could cross more or less immediately. A lot of pedestrian zones and excellent sidewalks where you really have enough space. Good, and this is what Aspern Seestadt looks like today. It's a screenshot from Google Maps. So this is really the actual status. So you see there's already a lot of development. I think this picture is maybe a year old, so now they already have more. And yeah, and now I want to show what became of all these mobility guidance. Yeah, so the modal split targets remain. The maximum parking allowance was set at 0.7. There is a mobility fund for mobility management measures. So it was even the winner of an award because this was a completely new concept at the time. There are information packages. The car parking is indeed in collective garages. There is a supply of electrical bicycles, which by now have become much more common than back in 2008. There are car sharing spaces. There are very high cycle parking standards. There are good cycle routes. There is a free repair for cycles every Thursday. We have this good pedestrian infrastructure. And we even have some houses where you have so-called Baugruppen in German, co-housing groups, where the tenants plan together this housing, and they even achieve even more reduced car parking standards. Here are some links that you can use at the end of the webinar. Now, another example is Freiburg-Vauban. It's in Germany. So it's in the very south west corner of Germany in the country of Baden-Württemberg, and this is the city of Freiburg. And here you see the position of this new city district. So it's a relatively small and dense development. And it's the most successful car-free living through land use planning experiment I know of. As a background, Freiburg has about 230,000 inhabitants, and it grows about 1% per year. And the modal split is one of the best that I know of. So you have only 21% by the trips by car, 34% by bicycle, 29% on foot, and 16% public transport. So it's one of the few cities where bicycle as well as public transport is quite well developed. Now, and in this city, there was an old military barracks from the French. It's named after a French general, Vauban. And this was abandoned by the military in the 1990s. And the plan was made to have a car-free living zone in this district. So here you see what it looked like at the beginning of the 1990s. And this is a picture from about 10 years ago. And you see it's a complete diverse new development. Here there is a tram line entering the district. And here you see a large collective parking garage. There's almost no parking here in this city district. Some details about it. So there was a very high degree of citizens' participation. There were also these Baugruppen, so co-housing developments. There were 30 co-housing units in Vauban, and every one of the people who were going to live there had to sign a mobility contract. They obliged the tenants to finance parking just in case it doesn't work. So what does it mean? So they said, we don't want to have parking in this city, only in a collective garage. And we estimate that, so they signed, we will not use the car, but in case people would still buy a car, they had to oblige themselves to pay for a place in the collective garage. And even if the collective garage would not be enough, that a new one would have to be built. Yeah? So the people that live here said, we won't buy a car. Yeah. And some people said, okay, we will use a car, but we have a place here in the collective garage. But this was only allowed in a little part of the city, of this new city district. So all the households there were more or less car-less, except for the people who have this place. So the control of this obligation was via a Car-Free Living Association. And they have in the city district excellent mobility alternatives to the cars. So there's a car sharing there, a cycle network, there's shared space almost everywhere, and there's a tram line directly going into the district. There are very small lots, and that guarantees a very diverse architecture. There are many small shops on the main streets. It is said that this is the city district with the highest share of children in Germany. I have no way to prove this, but that's what they told me when I visited there, and I saw a lot of children. And the motorization in the car-reduced part overall, so also with the districts that where you're not explicitly forced not to have a car, is about 150 vehicles per 1,000 inhabitants. And that's very low. That's so. For example, we have in Vienna we have about 400 vehicles per 1,000 inhabitants, and in Austria we have 600 vehicles per 1,000 inhabitants. Yeah, and here's some pictures from this city. It was a very gray day. Here's the tram line entering the district. And this is what it looks like. You have cycle parking, and you have very diverse architecture. Here the tram line, and you see parking is possible on the main street to a limited extent. But in all the side streets, you cannot park. It was, as I said, it was a gray day, but you still saw children playing on the streets. So it's really very child friendly. It's very quiet. It's very nice. Looks very nice to live there. Yeah, here you see a car parking, but this is only allowed for deliveries. So if you have did some shopping, you can of course drive to your house and get rid of the shopping, but then you have to leave the street again. This is the collective parking garage. It's called the Solar Garage, what you see here, because they have they have solar collective cells on top. Well, and we had a look at the garage, and this was the last floor before the top floor, and this was the top floor. There was only one car. So they built this collective garage because they were worried that people would not keep the contracts, but it worked very well, and they never had to build what was planned in the beginning to build another collective garage. So it's a very successful scheme, and they could even have done with less parking places than they built. Yeah, that's the first 15 minutes or so of my webinar, and now I'm ready for questions. So Robert should switch on.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Karl-Heinz, for your presentation. I can see no chat questions from the side of our audience. Maybe in between you write some if you are interested in. In between, I could ask you one question. You showed us now a residential area where land use, or two residential areas, Vauban and Seestadt, where land use planning and mobility management were implemented in a very good way. Do you have also some examples from other areas, maybe not residential, but commercial or administrative districts where this has been implemented so far? Is there something?
Yeah, there's a very good example in Zurich. So this is called Seal City, which is a shopping center and also an entertainment center with cinemas. Yeah, and it's quite near to the center. And the interesting thing about this is that in Zurich they have these rules that every big new development has to show what will be the mobility impact. So they have to estimate how many car trips will be generated by this development. And then once they have done this, they get obligations from the local government how much they are allowed to generate, and they have to put in place measures. And so this is really a big shopping center, but it has a very good connection to public transport. And they built especially public transport stop. They have a delivery system. They have special marketing measures. So in all, what you see in this example from Seal City is that even when you have a shopping center where you think, okay, shopping center is automatically a lot of cars, it doesn't have to be that way. It can work with a limited amount of car parking spaces. And in Seal City, about 60% of the customers there come with sustainable modes, so either on foot, public transport, or by bicycle.
Thank you, Karl-Heinz. Seal City is really a good example. I have been there. I did once a video clip, now I remember, and I put it on Altis. I'm not sure if it's still on Altis, but also within the Push and Pull project, which was dealing with parking management, we had Seal City as a kind of good practice or best practice examples where we described it in a very comprehensive way. Also the idea of reducing the number of parking spaces from year to year, which is one of the obligations there. If you are interested in, I could provide the case study on Seal City, the description, very easily to you. Just put your name on the list and we will send it to you. I can see there is no other question coming in. Are you still keen on that? Otherwise, we continue with your second part. Oh, there's something coming in from Patrick Auwerks. He spoke about Vauban. High degree of participation was in from the start, he said. This is one of the prerequisites of SUMP, the participation process. Yeah. Patrick is an expert on communication. He knows a lot about this. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, well, in Vauban, you had the special situation that a part of this territory was occupied by citizens, and they demanded that we would have a nice development there. So from the beginning on, you had a sort of a pressure group that already said we want to participate in the planning. We want to have a say in the planning. That was, of course, an advantage. And then in Freiburg, you have a really participative climate and very active citizens. So they installed a development organization that was specifically there to listen to the wishes from future residents there. And they also encourage this collective planning, and that's why you have 30 of these Baugruppen there. And that was, of course, for the whole city planning, it was very helpful that you had such active participants. Normally, it's so that you have to search for such people, and there you had already a good basis. But on the other hand, you also have to say that Freiburg was very welcoming and was encouraging this. And it's very rare that a city does it, and that but it was really a success story.
In Freiburg, there's a very high discussion on this terminology of car-free living. They are not happy with it, as there are very big opponents, and they decided to call it, instead of car-free living, car-reduced living. So people, as you said, have the possibility to own a car, but to put it in the collective garage, as you said. But the terminology car-reduced living is much better. That's what Peter Schick, the person in charge of the city of Freiburg, told me. And once they go for another such an area, they would never use again the terminology of car-free living.
Exactly, that's correct, yeah.
Okay, continue with your presentation.
Okay, the following is more or less some more examples, but also a bit of a summary. and how you can achieve that, what tools there are. Yeah. So what is the influence of land use planning on mobility? Yeah, in a sort of few headlines. So one thing is, of course, density. Yeah, the denser your development, the better collective transfer provisions work. Yeah. If you have all detached homes, it's very difficult. Yeah? But if you have developments like in Freiburg-Vauban, in Aspern, you can really do sustainable transport. If you have in your land use plan provisions for walking, walk paths, dense walking network, then it will be built and people can walk. Oops, sorry. One important aspect is also that people like to have attractive walking surroundings, like to see some things when they walk. And that's why it's important to do something on the ground floor zone, so that you, in the ground floor zone of each development, you have shops or restaurants or open offices or services like libraries or startup companies, so that it's attractive and that it's not just so the worst would be that you only have the entrances of parking garages. Yeah, that's not very interesting. Or if you have just glass walls where you don't see anything. And that brings me to the thing on monotony versus diversity. So monotonous architecture that looks more or less the same everywhere is boring, and people don't like to walk there. They like to see very many different styles of architecture. So a solution is that in this land use plan you have small plots and many architects, and that generates then a more diverse architecture for one area. Of course, it's also important to think of green space, of children's space, so you need to provide this in the land use plan. And it's always better to have a mixed usage instead of a mono usage. So if you have only living, you get a sort of a sleeping city, and people will not be on the street during the day. And if you have only working, then you also have not a regular usage of the street, of the environment. So if you have a more mixed usage, you will have urban life. Then you should think about services that they should be in walking distances. Services like doctors, shops, playgrounds, cafes, they shouldn't be too far apart. In the land use plan, you can also put cycling provisions. So, of course, space for a cycle path network, but very important is also bicycle parking. So if you oblige the developers to provide for cycling parking, which is possible, then they will have to build it, and then people can own bicycles and they can use bicycles. And if you have public transport, which you should have in a larger development, then living and working should be concentrated around the stops, and then you have better service. And what I already told you about is the parking provisions. So you can put lower and upper limits on parking for many types of land use. And that's important. You say the old thinking was, okay, if I have some shopping, I must provide a minimum of parking spaces, because if there's not enough parking space, then the shop doesn't work very well. And now it generated an enormous amount of parking. Much too much than is really necessary. And now planners have started to think in an other way. They say, okay, we cap the parking, we put on a maximum allowance. And that means that not everything can be done by car, and that you have more incentive to use sustainable transport. You can limit the space provided for streets and roads. You don't have to have very wide streets. You can set design recommendations in the land use planning. And you can have, as Robert said, car reduced living provisions. So in cities, many people, not everybody, but many people can live without possessing cars, provided there is good access to good alternatives. Now here's an other district from Vienna. It's the new district Nordbahnhof. So what you see here is a quite dense development. Here's a big school, and here you have a very nice park. But what you see is that on this plot, everything was planned by one architect, so it's quite monotonous. Yeah? This also is a very big one. It's maybe not so attractive to have this. And what I noticed when I visited there is there's only one cafe that's here. And there's nothing on the whole park where you have some interesting things in the ground floor zone. So that's a real, was not very well planned in this aspect. But now I want to come to this place here. This is a so-called Baugruppen object, so where there was a collective effort, a co-housing effort for planning. This is what it looks like. It's called the Wohnprojekt Wien. About 65 adults, 40 children live there. It has 7 floors. And it has only 8 parking spaces for cars. Yeah? They did the planning together, and they also agreed, okay, we don't want to invest a lot of money into parking garages. It's very expensive. It's about 25,000, 35,000 per place. So they saved money on this, and they do everything by car sharing. And with the money that they save, they could afford to have a luxurious tool workshop. They have roof gardens for everybody, a sauna. There are guest apartments, so not every apartment needs a guest room. They have guest apartment for everybody. They have special playrooms for children. They have nice garden installations. They have rooms to have events, and they have a communal kitchen. So a communal kitchen, everybody has a kitchen in its apartment, but they also have a big one where you can dine together. So they could afford this because they saved a lot on parking spaces. And still, they have 120 bicycle parking spaces that are in the ground floor. So very attractive, and that's the main mode of transport that they use. Yeah. What I said at the beginning, it's a very good idea if you do land use planning to do workshop with stakeholders and that should be done as early as possible. We developed this in the MAX project, sort of a simulation workshop, and you can use this as guideline and template if you want to do a workshop on land use planning with a lot of stakeholders. It's important to invite all relevant stakeholders. So, for example, we also invited the Chamber of Commerce. We had all the political parties and they could all participate. And it was very good that we had a series of workshops, because in the first one you cannot decide on everything. It's good to have people think about new ideas, and that's also the how we developed this mobility fund. Yeah, we said, okay, if we save a lot on parking spaces, what could we do with that? And then in the next workshop we made a suggestion that some money goes into a mobility fund, and we explained what we could do with that. Yeah. And in this workshop, it's very important or essential that you assess the transport impacts. There's a model for that, for example, in Zurich, what they used for Seal City. So they had a special calculation model where they said, okay, if I have a shop of this size and this type, this generates this amount of trips. And yeah, and that's important if you do such a workshop, that you think about this, that you have a model where you can have at least a rough assessment, a rough guess what mobility development you will have for certain developments. Important is to have sustainable transport options as precondition. Here you see another example from Vienna that's not so very good. Yeah? So in the middle of a very dense development, you provide a lot of car parking spaces. It's maybe not the best idea. So it's good to have public transport, bicycle paths. High density helps, of course, and you can improve the infrastructure conditions by reducing the street widths. increasing the public transport offer, getting public transport active before the first inhabitants and employees come. What you saw in Aspern Seestadt, they built the tram line. Also, I think in Vauban it was also that they built the tram line before the first dwellings were ready. Having space for cycling, quality, bicycle parking, and well-managed car parking. If you don't have this, so no good sustainable transport options, then mobility management is more or less useless. It won't work because if there are no alternatives, it won't work. So you have to organize your mobility in a smart way. This one runs on fat and saves you money. This one runs on money and makes you fat. And now I want to do a poll just to show you how even in a car-oriented place like New York, you don't have to own a car. So the question is, how many households in East Harlem, that's this place in Manhattan, do not have a car? So the share of households that do not have a car. And these are my options. And now Robert has to activate the poll. I cannot do that. So please make your guess. Do you
Only
see
6 people participate so far. Are you going to now we have 8. Okay, it's a tendency. I will stop the poll now to show you the results.
Okay, so most people guessed 74%. Well, in fact, it's 84%. Yeah. So in East Harlem, New York, only 12% of the trips are made by car. That's because they have excellent public transport and because it's pretty useless to use your car there, and it's extremely expensive to park. Yeah? And they didn't provide a lot of parking there. So even in New York, Manhattan, this is possible. Now, if you look at the center of Vienna, there you also have shares like that you only have 40% or 35% of the households own a car, and the others use cycling or public transport or walking. And it's a good thing because the cars stand idle, park for 23 hours per day, but they occupy 90% of the public spaces. So if people don't own a car, you have more public space and you don't have a very inefficient hardware standing around. That's what I want to repeat again, is you have to manage parking. Very important. So maximum parking allowances instead of minimum parking requirements. There's also what also was done in Aspern partly, that if you cannot achieve certain parking requirements, they could pay this off. They could say, okay, we won't build it, but we pay a certain amount to the city. It's also a possibility that you can do in the land use planning. You should really manage on-street parking, show at least duration restrictions so that you can only park for 3 hours or 1.5 hours. Better is that it's paid parking. It's also important that you organize the enforcement, that you have some sort of control, because else it won't work. And when you limit this, it's in favor of pedestrians, greenery, sitting spaces, and good visibility for people that are crossing. And it's better to have a few collective garages instead of parking in every basement. So this is in Freiburg-Vauban and Seestadt Aspern. So one aspect, you know, if you have your car in the basement, yeah, you just have to go down and jump in the car and you drive. That's very comfortable, and it's a very strong, it's a very strong incentive to use the car. If you have to walk 200 meters or 300 meters, you are more apt to think about alternatives like, well, then I could walk to the public transport stop as well, or I could use the bicycle, or I could walk anyway, because I don't want to go into this garage and get my car if it goes quickly. So that's very important to have such collective garages. And here are some important steps for mobility management in the planning legislation, in the planning process, where you can sort of intervene with certain regulations. So one is, there's always for large developments, at least in Austria and in many European countries, you have environmental legislation. So the environmental legislation said you should have some limits on emissions, and if the development looks like it will have a lot of car driving, then you have problems with environmental legislation. In the overall planning process, you can influence what is happening. So every city makes, every 10 years, they make the land use plan for the city new, and there you can intervene. You can set the planning conditions, and you can put certain obligations in this citywide land use planning. You can also work on the parking regulations. So many cities have switched from minimum parking requirements to maximum parking allowances, or they have abolished all parking regulation, and this tends to lead to lower parking provisions in the planning process. Well, in many countries, you're obliged for certain developments to make what is called a detailed site development plan. That's much more precise than a general land use plan, the Bebauungsplan. And in this detailed site development plan, it's a process with the city government. You can introduce certain regulations. That's also a good option to have this. And then you have the building permission process, and that's always a good instance where you can say, okay, you can only get this building permission where you will earn a lot of money if you pay for mobility management, or for certain public transport developments, or for cycle parking, and so on. So that you can build into the building permission process. Also important is you put in a lot of rules in all these permissions and plannings. And what often happens is that, okay, they sign all the papers, but then they don't do what they're obliged to. And therefore you need some monitoring, evaluation, some enforcement, and also sometimes you have to adapt the whole planning, and you should provide for this. That's also an important aspect. How you can assure funding and implementation of mobility management. So environmental impact assessment can have this as a consequence. You can, of course, always provide advice during the planning or building permission process. That's what they had in Freiburg, and also in Aspern. They have an own development organization that helps the developers. You can include it in the planning conditions and obligations, into the parking regulation, and you can get it into the detailed site development plan and in the building permission process. So most important is you need to inform, information, so that all the stakeholders know what this is about. So the developers need to know, okay, well, okay, if I don't have to can build so many parking spaces, how can I sell my development? Yeah, you have to show, okay, we have a lot of options there. You will have good cycle parking, we will have excellent public transport, and so on. Employees that come to a new factory or new business, they could get information how they should move around in the new city district. Same for new residents, same for schools. It's good to have a mobility center. It can be integrated with an information center on the development, so that the people who sell houses also know something about mobility. And it's good to have a web space on this aspect of the development. car sharing. So it's good if you have car sharing from the beginning on. It's nice to provide, and it's not very expensive to provide for bike sharing, bike rental, bike repair, bicycle info. This gives the feeling, okay, this development, they have thought about cycling. And then there can be special integrated offers, such as a job ticket or this parking cash out, a mobility budget or integrated yearly ticket. So the last aspect, in some developments we have seen that all the tenants get a yearly ticket for free for the first year or for the first 2 years. It's integrated in the whole cost of the development. Yeah, how does it relate to sustainable urban mobility planning? Well, you have to see land use planning is statutory. I don't know how to pronounce it exactly. Statutory, so that means it's obligatory by law, while sustainable urban mobility plans in most countries are not obligatory. Land use planning can run on different levels. So the general land use plan on regional level, the city land use plan, and sometimes also the detailed site development plan. Optimum would be that the urban mobility planning and the land use planning run in parallel in a very coordinated way. That would be the best, so that they always communicate with each other, the various departments. But very often this is separated. So it would be nice that if you make a sustainable urban mobility plan, that you provide in it for how do we connect with land use planning. As I said, often it's impossible to coordinate this. And that's why it's important to strive for communication between the departments and for joint workshops, and if possible, well in advance of the development of specific sites. Here you see a screenshot of the website from EPOM, where you can use this Max Lupo. This is the tool that was developed in the Max project. So there are guidelines for the integration of mobility management, site-based measures. There's a database on examples. So I encourage you to have a look. The link is provided in this presentation, and you see there are a lot of case studies. Some of them are a bit outdated, but you can find this Aspern Seestadt. Okay. And yeah, now I'm coming to the end. These are the links. They will be provided to you. And I hope this webinar was useful for you, and now I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Karl-Heinz. This was hardcore stuff. 2 questions come in. 2 questions from a colleague of us, Miklos Ola from the city of Seestadt. I don't know if you're aware, the city of Seestadt is the winner city of the Civitas Legacy Award this year, so they are pretty far forward regarding SUMP, regarding planning. Also, the SUMP is one of the champion city SUMPs available in the internet on the Prosperity website. Miklos Ola asks 2 questions. The one is, when you showed the area that were new developed, where you showed, for instance, only 1 cafe in this Nordbahn area in Vienna, he wants to ask, how is it possible to influence the private owners to use these ground floors for, let's say, a better use than only as a garage or as a residential area, so to make it a little bit more diverse? Usually you cannot force them or, let's say, yeah, tell them what they should do with their own property, but maybe to nudge them. Do you have any answer on that? And his second question is an easier one. What is an example for a minimum parking requirement?
Okay. Concerning this ground floor, well, you can force developers. It's what happens. For example, here in my city in Graz. So if you have a new development, they just say, okay, the ground floor cannot be used for dwelling or for garages, or only in a limited way. It has to be used for office space or for shops. And it's written in the detailed site development plan or in the building permission. So that's what happens, and that can happen because there's so much interest. If you live in a city where you have 1% growth per year, there's a lot of pressure. The developers want to build housing, and yeah, if they say, okay, yeah, you can have this new plot, yeah, we will change the way it is reserved, and you can earn a lot of money on it, but you have to provide something in the ground floor. Yeah. And that's how it happens. Sometimes it's also so that the city sort of subventions certain things there, that they say, okay, for the first 3 years, we pay you the rent or pay half of the rent of the ground floor development. Because in the beginning, it's always difficult to get new shops there. So that's the way it's done. It's developers are indeed to some extent forced to it. Yeah. The other question was, can you repeat it, Robert?
Yeah, you can read it. What is an example for minimum parking requirements?
Minimum parking requirements. Well, if you have, I don't know the numbers by heart, but so say you make a new shopping center or a new supermarket somewhere, then they say, okay, you have how much floor space do you have? Okay, 1,000 or 2,000 square meters. 2,000 square meters. For every 100 square meters, you need 1 parking space or 3 parking spaces or whatever. That's the usual way. Or if you have built a new apartment block and there are going to live there will be 20 apartments. To say for every apartment you need 1 parking space, or at least 1 or 1.5 parking spaces. Yeah, you have some areas in Austria that are not in the city centers where they say you have to build at least 2. Yeah, because people want to have 2 cars per apartment. Yeah, that's the minimum. The other thing is that you can only are not allowed to build more than that. So in Aspern, they said you cannot build more than 0.7 car parkings for every apartment.
Okay, I see that Miklos understood the idea. There is another statement from Patrick Overks from the Park for SUMP project. He's the coordinator of this newly started project, which kicked off in Umeå in Sweden. And he said Umeå's green buy-off instrument is also a good example. Park for SUMP will deal with it with stakeholder involvement and developers. But Park for SUMP only started, but we will have webinars in Park for SUMP. We will provide trainings in Park for SUMP on that. And of course, the example of Umeå's green buy-off will be one of the case studies in this concern. Thank you, Patrick, for this. I think we are at the end of our webinar from the time. I would like to thank you for participation here, for staying with us for more than 60 minutes now. And I would like to mention again the next one, which is on 29th of November. It is from Patrick Overks, Mobile 21 from Belgium, and he will talk about stakeholder involvement and institutional cooperation. So I will stop this webinar now. Thanks for watching.
Maybe one mention.
Yeah.
Sorry. We will send you the link with the recording and also with the presentation.
Okay. Thanks again for repeating that. Okay. Bye. See you next time.